on our relatives.
Thank you very much. Right, you'll firstly notice I've changed the colour. Michael seemed to think I was going for an Irish look. I was actually going for a Covent Garden look, but we're going for grey. So if anyone has problems looking at green, you don't need to worry, it's all grey now. I just want to get rid of your pictures. Hold on 1 minute. Thank you. Right, so Covent Garden, situated in the West End of London, was the place described by Dickens as a fine, dissipated, insoluble mystery. It was the site of the old Hummums, the name deriving from the Arabic Hammams, Turkish baths. By the mid-19th century, it was a gentleman's only hotel. In 1853, Dickens says of the place, "We have a general idea that the passages at the old Hummums lead to groves of gorgeous bedrooms, eating out the whole of the adjacent houses, where chamberlains who have never been in bed themselves for 50 years show any country gentleman who rings at the bell at any hour of the night to luxurious repose in palatial apartments fitted up after the Eastern manner. We have slept there in our time, but that makes no difference." In 1860, Dickens introduced his readers to his penultimate novel, Great Expectations, a tale of rags to riches with a few twists. Pip is forced to take refuge at the old Hummums after receiving the ominous message, "Don't go home." Now I've got to work out how this does. Oh, right. In those times, a bed was always to be got there at any hour of the night, and the chamberlain let me in at his ready wicket, lighted the candle next in order on his shelf, and showed me straight into the bedroom next in order on his list. It was a sort of vault on the ground floor at the back, with a despotic monster of a four-post bedstead in it, straddling over the whole place, putting one of his arbitrary legs into the fireplace and another into the doorway, and squeezing the wretched little washing stand in quite a divinely righteous manner. What a doleful night! How anxious, how dismal, how long! There was an hospital smell in the room of cold soot and hot dust. And as I looked up into the corners of the tester over my head, I thought what a number of blue bottle flies from the butchers and earwigs from the market and grubs from the country must be holding on up there, lying by for next summer. Corey McLaughlin in the Hummums Bath Brothel and Holy Shrine of Literary London explores the old Hummums by tracking its life through print. He begins with George Augustus Sala's 1887 50-page pamphlet called The Old Hummums Made New Again, and notes that although Sala considered it the most sacred place on earth, he acknowledges that we know very little about it. He details the various printed references, the tale of Parson Ford, supposedly the minister in Hogarth's A Midnight Modern Conversation, and the ghost in the story as retold in Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, a story which has been repeated in numerous publications and one Dickens was very aware of. William Makepeace Thackeray places the character of Osborne into the old Hummums the night before his wedding. George Crabbe, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Lewis Carroll all record their visits to the old Hummums. Others, often those who would have been otherwise forgotten, turn up in the old Hummums as witnesses or the accused in the Old Bailey trials, or as the main focus of coroners' inquests. And then there are many who sent letters to and from the hotel. Often it is just their name on an envelope that turn up on the auction sites. McLaughlin concludes that the Hummums as a cultural site remains obscure to our contemporary thinking, and lasting questions of its interior and the patron experience remain. It's been 16 years since Corrie contacted me of my interest in the old Hummums. I can only add a little more to the jigsaw puzzle of the old Hummums through the people who were connected to the building. So let me start by giving a very rough background to the development of Covent Garden and the old Hummums. Originally called Convent Garden, it was the site of land belonging to the Abbey of Westminster that after much toing and froing ended up in the hands of the Russell family. In the 17th century, Francis Russell, the 4th Earl of Bedford, was somewhat of a businessman and could see an opportunity to make money in developing Covent Garden. He had already been successful in the draining of the fenlands in East Anglia and had rebuilt the estate house Woburn Abbey. In redesigning the area, he hoped to encourage the aristocrats to move in. He involved Inigo Jones, who created a church and a plaza surrounded by arcaded houses. History didn't help things. Very few titled people settled there, and it was actually the artistic types who were drawn in. Russell got a licence for a market to take place in the Piazza Square, and by the 1760s, the market occupied most of this area, with it becoming the largest fruit and vegetable market in the country, although it sold much more than this, including pet hedgehogs to control household pests and caged birds. The noise of carts, animals, and people, and the smell of rotting food led to people converting loft spaces into rooms to escape. Entertainment took the form of puppet shows at the side of the church, demonstrations by quacks, political debate, and the opening of the two theatres, the Theatre Royal in 1674 and Covent Garden Theatre in 1732, and the establishment of the Magistrate's Office and Court in Bow Street, increased the volume of people and the demand for places to eat and stay. Numerous hot bath or bagnios, coffee houses, lodging houses, and hotels sprung up. Often, they provided much more than a refreshment, as Harris's very popular Annual Directory of Prostitutes, published 1757 to 1795, suggests. The bagnios, Richardson tells us, trod a fine line between respectability and disreputability, much as the sauna establishment does now. The oldest bagnio was the Old Hummums, which had opened in 1683 for sweating and bathing. In 1739, John Rigg was the owner and advertised his services. On his death in 1763, his nephew John Henry Rigg took over the property. In March 1769, a fire at John Bradley's, a distiller on Russell Street, and that's the street that led on to the Little Piazza, completely destroyed the four buildings, including the Old Hummums. They were rebuilt, but the portico walk was removed and the buildings were set back several feet. The Old Hummums was at number 3. No women were ever admitted. In 1780, a new owner, George Kennard, and his family arrived. George is my 5th great-grandfather. He had married Elizabeth Kennard, yes, that is her maiden name, in 1763 at St. Magdalene, Bermondsey, when he was 23 and she was 26. They then had moved to Chancery Lane, where by 1774, 6 children had been born to the couple. George also had a brother called John, a carpenter of Bermondsey and a witness to George's wedding, who had married Mary Barber, a widow of a pub landlord of St. Mary's Axe in 1766. Her husband, William, had died the year before. John had joined the Carpenters Guild on the 7th of October to gain the freedom of the city by redemption. And then on the 19th of October, he married Mary at St. Andrew's Undershaft. George, his brother, was witness to this marriage. John died in 1791, aged 57, leaving Mary a widow for a second time, and with the 2 children, John and Mary, who survived to adulthood. She died in 1806. On the 13th of May, 1780, George Kennard, gentleman, and John Henry Rigg, gentleman, entered into a lease from the 1st of May, 1780, for a term of 54 years for a mortgage of £5,000 plus interest. George took out insurance with the Sun Fire Insurance Office, calling himself a bagnio keeper. He did not have long to enjoy this role. In September 1781, he wrote his will and was dead in January 1782, being buried at St. Paul's Covent Garden Churchyard on the 10th of January. Elizabeth, a widow at 44, was left to run the business and look after her 4 surviving children, George, Elizabeth, Mary Hannah, and Anne. A coroner's inquest of 1793 gives additional details about the hotel. James Jenkins was waiter here, and wine was not sold. In 1792, her daughter Elizabeth marries Richard Wisson, and they have a daughter, Mary Hannah. A few years later, in 1794, her only surviving son, George, marries Sarah Abraham, the daughter of John Abraham, a builder of St. Pancras, and sister to Robert Abraham, surveyor and architect. George writes his will in March 1807 and dies shortly afterwards, and is buried at St. Paul's, Covent Garden. His will, which is not granted probate until May 1811, leaves everything to his wife for her life, and at her death, it was to be shared with his surviving children. The executors are his cousin, John Kennard of Red Cross Street, Smithfield, and his brother-in-law, Robert Abraham of Percy Street. Elizabeth continues running the hotel, but in 1809, her daughter, Mary Hannah, at the age of 34, marries James Hewitt, aged 28, and he starts managing the hotel with his mother-in-law. James and Mary Hannah had married in the Church of England as required by law, but James was a nonconformist and belonged to the independent congregation of the Barbican Meeting House. Also part of this congregation was John Kennard, the cousin of James's wife, Mary Hannah, Ebenezer Taylor, a business partner of John's, Thomas Challis, and Isaac Davis, John Kennard's brother-in-law and husband of Mary. The first child of James and Mary was Emma Hewitt, who'd been born 20th of May 1811 and was baptised on the 16th of September 1813. Her birth was registered at the Red Cross Street Library. Mary Davis, née Kennard, was a witness to the birth. In February 1816, Elizabeth dies at the age of 78 and requests in her will that she was buried in the churchyard near her son and husband. She leaves to her daughter Elizabeth, wife of Richard Wisson, an annual annuity of £10 per year, payable quarterly and for her use and control only. Her estate, goods, chattels, monies, securities for money and effects were to be shared equally between her two daughters, Anne and Mary Hannah, as tenants in common and for their own use only. She requests that husbands do not intermeddle. James Jenkins, the waiter, was one of the witnesses to the will. Her daughter Anne had married Jonas White, a painter and glazier, by the time of her death, but there is no mention of her daughter-in-law Sarah, who had married George, her son. Following Elizabeth's death, James Hewitt and Jonas White ran the hotel as a partnership until 1890, when it was dissolved. James, his wife Mary Hannah, and his daughter Emma continued living in and managing the hotel. In February 1821, his wife dies, aged 46. Their niece, Mary Hannah Wisson, the daughter of Richard Wisson and Elizabeth Kennard, had been living with them. In 1823, James marries her, thereby creating a very confusing family tree. They had 6 children, providing their sons the names of the other connected and related families. Jonas White took over the running of the Imperial Hotel at No. 1 Tavistock Row. He was not only a painter and glazier, but also a wine merchant. He leased the house next door to the old Hummums at No. 4 Little Piazza. Anne, Jonas's wife, died in 1833. Up to 1882, a woman's property, with the exception of a few personal trifles, was considered her husband's, so she could not leave a will without her husband's permission. Spinsters and widows could leave wills. Anne, on her death in 1832, had got permission from Jonas. Of course, her mother had left instructions in her will about husbands not interfering with her daughter's inheritance, but whether it was this or Jonas was a reasonable man, we don't know. So Anne died in 1832 and left a will, written with her husband's consent. She had purchased 2,500 3.5% Bank of England annuities in her name with the permission of her husband, and now had the permission of her husband to dispose of them in such a manner as she thinks fit. She leaves the interest and dividends to Jonas for his life, and after his death to be divided equally between her nieces and nephews. And there she names them: Jemima Ann Noverre, wife of George Noverre, George Augustus Kennard, Sarah Abraham Kennard, Edwin John Kennard, children of my late brother John. Emma Hewitt, spinster, the daughter of my late sister Mary Hannah, and Mary Ann Hewitt, wife of James Hewitt, the daughter of my sister Elizabeth Lawson. The executors were Jonas White, James Hewitt, and Alan Davis of Newbridge Street, an auctioneer. Alan Davis is the son of Isaac Davis and Mary Kennard. James Hewitt took a new lease out in 1835. It was later amended to end in 1865. The rent was £160 per annum, with a license to provide tea, coffee, or a glass of wine, and a biscuit or refreshment, but not dinner, to any person residing temporarily or otherwise in the old Hummums between 12 noon and 7 o'clock in the evening. On the 6th of June 1841, the census records James and his wife and 5 children at the old Hummums. There are 7 males and 7 females, servants, and 27 visitors to the hotel. 10 years later, on 30th of March, the census records that James Hewitt, aged 70, and his wife Marianne, aged 55, are at the old Hummums with 4 adult children. There are 12 servants, 2 barmaids, a chamberlain, 4 waiters, 1 porter, 1 cook, 2 housemaids, a kitchen maid, and there are 20 visitors, including solicitors, gentlemen, surveyors, surgeons, army officer, railway secretary, and a law student. A couple of others did not give an occupation. Next door at the new Hummums, John Rockley had Alfred Dickens as a lodger. Charles's brother is recorded as married, aged 29, a civil engineer, and from Chatham, Kent. His surname is actually spelled Dickens. The following day, 31st of March, 1851, James Hewitt dies. Coincidentally, so does John Dickens, father of Charles, at Keppel Street, Russell Square. On the 25th of April, at a meeting at the Strand, the licence was transferred to Marianne Hewitt. In the 1861 census, Marianne is a widow, aged 65, with her stepdaughter Emma and 3 of her own children. One had since married a butcher called Tucker, and there was 12 lodgers at the hotel. Elizabeth Peacock is visiting, and there are 12 servants. The lodgers are all male. Mary Ann continues running the hotel until the lease runs out in 1865. James left a will, leaving Mary Ann as the sole executor and guardian of their children. He gifted Emma, his own daughter, £500 that she had already received a portion under her mother's marriage settlement. Sarah Jones Pickard, Anne Axford, his cousin, Sarah Kennard and Sarah Abraham Kennard, his friends Robert Abraham and Thomas Moore, and children of John Kennard, deceased, Mary Davis, widow, Henry Clark and his wife, Mary Sophia, John George, John Hunt and Marianne, his wife, Ebenezer Taylor and William Grimes. He also includes his brother, George Hewitt. The witnesses are James Parry, an artist, and Edward Tucker, the butcher previously mentioned. And this is 1852. This is Marianne Hewitt, who's just reused the James Hewitt and crossed that out. And on her bill, she's actually she's written Marianne Hewitt there, but actually writes M-A-H. I think that she starts using M-A-H as opposed to her full name. Finally, September 1865, there is a notice in the paper to sell by auction at the well-known Old Hummums Hotel, Covent Garden, and following days, the valuable effects comprising bedsteads, bedding, bedroom furniture, Brussels carpets and hearth rugs, chimney, glasses, window curtains, cornicas, dining and coffee room tables, etc., and a capital 14-foot 6 oak press and other effects, chandeliers, gas fittings. And that was the end of the Old Hummums. And I seem to have rushed through that. I think I must have missed out a bit.